welcome everyone. And Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Amparo. Good evening, everyone. My name is Danny Diaz, and I'm there in the middle of your screen, the Mexican in the middle of the screen. I'm the director of the project. I'm great to be here. I'm grateful to be here with all of you and supporting this this really important work that Amparo is working on. If you have any questions, I'll try to be responsive in the chat, tech issues or anything otherwise. You can direct questions at me if you need to. Thanks. Go ahead, Cindy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Cindy Mata, Associate Director of the project. And I identify as Guanaca, which is like an endearing term that Salvadorans use to self-identify. And thank you all for being here.
And then I can introduce myself. So I'm the one with the SpongeBob shirt. My name's Mark, and I'm the program coordinator for the history project. So also, if you run into any issues, I'm also here to help. And I do identify as Latino. And yeah, and then Vanessa.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Herrera. I'm the falling leaf there. Pretty excited about fall. I identify as Latina, Chicana, Mexicana, Mexican American. From de aquí y allá, I've worked pretty hard to sort of like embrace all the terms. I am an educator and a teacher. I've taught middle school and high school. I've been in education. I've been in the classroom for about 12, I spent 12 years in the classroom.
Great. And I had the honor and pleasure of working with Vanessa when she was a beginning teacher. So she's been working with the project for a long time, and recently we reconnected. So we're excited to have her join us. So please, we want to welcome everyone, right? And so if you could please tell us in the chat your name, your school, the grades you teach or you work with. And then if somebody can put the native land link in the chat. If you do not know what historical, cultural, indigenous land you are joining us from, this will help you find it. And I apologize for the typo. I'm having issues typing today. Sorry, I'm misspelling everything. Great. Welcome everyone. And if someone can do a little bit of a shout out who's in the chat, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll take care of that, Amparo. Looks like people are just typing right now. Welcome, Jacob. Jacob Winter, Cajon High School, 7th, 10th, and 11th, and college on Serrano land. Leo Glaze, the Waverly School. What's up, Leo? Waverly School in Pasadena. Tongva Land, middle school history teacher. Okay, Veronica Ciprain. Let me know if I mispronounced that. I teach in the Inland Empire. It's my 6th year teaching. I teach all 3 social studies courses at the middle school. Wow, 6th through 8th for the SPED department. Welcome, Veronica.
Hi, it's Ciprian. Pretty close.
Ciprian. Apologies. Thank you for correcting me.
All right.
Ronnie Spiritu, Ethnic Studies Instructional Coach. What's up, Ron? 16th year as an educator. I work with schools in the MacArthur Park area of LA. I'm living on Tongva land.
Ahora sí, Amparo.
All right. Go ahead, Cindy.
All right. So thank y'all for putting that up in the chat. And so we also want to acknowledge that as a land grant institution, UCLA History Geography Project also acknowledges the Tongva Gabrielino people as the traditional caretakers, the unceded land, originally known as Torongar, currently the Los Angeles Basin, to the Southern Channel Islands. And we thought, since we were going to be talking about Indigenous groups across Mesoamerica today, that we would spend some time really thinking through land acknowledgements. So Amparo, if you can move to the next slide. One more time. And so why do we do land acknowledgements, right? Land acknowledgements are an expression of gratitude and appreciation for those whose territory we reside on, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who protect and remain in relationship with the land and water where we gather, live, learn, and work on. Land acknowledgements bring us one step closer to being in right relationship with the people whose lands we are visitors on, whether that be by choice or forces out of our control. We also want to acknowledge that within land acknowledgements, language is an important component. And so if you go back, Amparo, one slide. I just want to show the land acknowledgement one more time. And wanted y'all to take a look at the words that were highlighted and underlined. And so when I'm saying that language is an important component, we really thought about as a team, what do we want to say in our land acknowledgements, right? And so we want to definitely call out that these are unceded lands, that the Tongva Gabrielino people have not given up their rights to the land. And we also wanted to add this idea of currently, because I heard an Indigenous scholar over the course of last year talk about how this land wasn't always Los Angeles, and so it has the ability, the possibility not to be one day, right? And so when we're talking about reparations, when we're talking about movements to give land back, then adding something like currently leaves the door open in terms of language for other possibilities to happen. And so as we leave these up real quick, I just want to give y'all a moment. You can unmute or you can type in the chat if you'd like, but we were interested in knowing if anyone already adds land acknowledgements to their presentations, either with their students or in their classrooms. Maybe you have them, maybe you have it up as a poster. And if so, is there some particular language that you highlight in your land acknowledgement? Something that's really important for you that you call out in your language, in your land acknowledgement. So we'll give y'all a moment to think about that. And if you do use land acknowledgements, you don't mind unmuting or typing in the chat what's a component, a piece of your land acknowledgement that that you highlight. Thank you, Veronica, for saying, I don't. I've noticed land acknowledgements are becoming more present though. Yeah, so this is also a good opportunity just to self-reflect, like what might that look like? I think, would you have it on each of your presentations? Would you have it up as a poster in your classroom? Would you encourage your school?
I think I would just go with my classroom to start with, because I think as everyone's been in the classroom, it's very hard to change a teacher's norm in the class, especially veteran teachers. So I think I would just start there, but I attended a few of the sessions that were offered in the summer, and it was common practice for it to be acknowledged. So I'm seeing maybe this is, the new trend that I guess we should kind of start.
Thank you so much for that.
Cindy, I think I'll add too that Not only in educational settings, but also in different nonprofit settings. I've definitely been in meetings in which folks are asked to reflect on the lands that they are inhabiting and who those lands belong to. And so not only are we seeing that in the classroom, but we're seeing that in other settings as well, as this acknowledgement of tribal lands and of the land that we are sitting on not necessarily belonging to us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I you know, as somebody who's sat with, like, who's seen a lot of land acknowledgements in the last couple of years, I think one of the things that came up for me over the summer when I was at a Free Minds, Free People conference is the, like, taking on acknowledging that I'm a visitor on this land. And, like, as somebody who's a person of diaspora, who, like, not everyone comes here by choice, right? But we are still all visitors. It was something that I hadn't reflected on that critically until this summer. So something that was brought to my attention by a Tonga scholar, and I was like, oh yeah, like, I may not have had a choice in coming to this country, but I am definitely still a visitor, and I definitely still want to be in right relation with First Nations people. And I'm seeing in the chat, Leo saying, I do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of each year in classes. I emphasize that this land was taken, stolen, and not given. We talk about actions over words, how land acknowledgements are performative if we are talking about supporting Indigenous area. Thank you for that. Actually, that's a good transition to the next slide, but I also see Nick before we transition. I did it at the beginning of the year and I would like to have a poster in my class. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. And, you know, to Leo's point, right? There's a lot of, you know, folks who are like, this is a good first step. And that's why I put that in the slide too, but like, how do we continue to be in right relationship? And so one of the things, Amparo, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is going beyond the land acknowledgement is getting informed and also centering our new learning and exposing our students to that, right? And so one thing that we want to acknowledge why we have our orange backgrounds today is that today is Canadian National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So in 2014, the Assembly of First Nations in Canada passed a resolution declaring September 30th Orange Shirt Day. And the resolution asked all Canadians to listen with open hearts to the stories of residential school survivors. It's orange for those of y'all who don't know the story because of Phyllis Weepstead, who is in our Google slide. She was sent to residential school when she was 9 years old, and she, on that day that the resolution was passed, she recounted the story of how her grandmother had bought her an orange shirt, and she, you know, like first day of school, back to school shopping, everyone can relate to that. How do you show up to your first day of school? But she showed up and was stripped of her orange shirt, and she recalls that moment as a very traumatic moment in which, like, she puts together later on that this was like the taking away of her culture. And so that's why folks are being asked to commemorate today by wearing an orange shirt. We want to acknowledge we got to as close as orange as possible, but that's why we made the background. And we want to acknowledge that the fight for Indigenous rights goes beyond borders, right? And so there's a big push to also make today a day of remembrance for all the folks, First Nations people in the US who attended boarding schools. And so we want to just honor that and amplify that today. And if you can go on to the next slide. And as we were also getting informed and learning, we came across this resource by Indigenous Educators on IG, which I totally suggest if you're not following them on any social media platform that you do. These are some of the questions that they posed for educators, and we want to leave these up here. You're more than welcome to unmute and answer if you'd like. But they too, right, also challenged us to be reflective on this day. So going beyond land acknowledgements, we can also introduce, right, how are you sharing, teaching about the history of boarding schools in your classroom? And maybe you haven't, and maybe that's your next step in going beyond the land acknowledgement, is making room in your classrooms and in your curriculum to address that. Thank you, Jacob. I see your answer to number 1 in the chat. And number 2? Definitely. Okay. I want to give folks a moment to just marinate on those questions, reflect on those questions. Perfect. And I think as an extension of this piece, Amparo, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. We also wanted to acknowledge that going beyond the land acknowledgement can also be, how can we be good allies, and how can we uplift and center the stories of what First Nations people are fighting for and working towards. And I'm so sorry, I don't think I gave enough pause time because I am seeing the chat right now, so I'll give you all an opportunity to look at the chat. Thank you, Ron, for that resource. Thank you, Leo, as well. Making those connections, definitely. Perfect. So yeah, and we also wanted to center the voices of youth as much as possible, right? And so we want to acknowledge that just recently, there were 9 children who had been buried at the Carlisle Indian School, who were brought back to their Indigenous lands. And that was due to the work of these 4 youth that you see on your screen. This was a 6-year-led effort by Lakota youth who really pushed their elders to do this work. And so sometimes when we're talking about repatriation and what First Nations people are fighting for, it is land, and it's also you know, making sure that we're being respectful and that their elders and their ancestors are with them on their lands. I'm also looking at the chat. Definitely, right? Letting tribe elders speak for themselves and tell us about their history. Perfect. One more slide, Amparo. And as we transition into the curricular materials that we're going to share with you all today, I also thought it was important to acknowledge, right, like we said in our post yesterday, that Indigenous rights go beyond boundaries. And so we wanted to acknowledge the land and water protectors across the Americas. Definitely making those connections with the water protectors in the US who are fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline and all the other pipelines, and also acknowledging, right, folks like Comandante Ramona in Mexico, Chiapas, Berta Cázares in Honduras, Isidro Perez in Guatemala, who are all indigenous leaders, elders, and now some of them ancestors, who are fighting for land and water rights across the Americas. And just in the middle, we wanted to highlight a couple of books that deal with this as well. So The Water Protectors is a book that covers the Dakota Access Pipeline, and then The Water Walker, which, thank you, Amparo, for introducing me to this book, is a story that captures a grandmother, Josephine Nandeman, I believe her name is, her wanting to bring awareness to water conservation and the need to see water as relative and protect the waters, especially along the Great Lakes, is where she did her work. So I wanted to give an opportunity to acknowledge folks doing the work. And lastly, we definitely wanted to also acknowledge that as we're talking about Latinx History Month, and as we talked about in our last couple of weeks about the indigenous communities that are coming to LA and to different parts of the US from across Latin America, we also wanted to acknowledge that COVID has adversely affected these communities, and also highlight where these communities are at. So I'm dropping into the chat right now a link that'll send you to this map. Cielo, a local organization whose Spanish acronym stands for Indigenous Communities and Leadership, collected data during COVID with UCLA so that the local organization gave aid to indigenous communities across LA County who weren't getting serviced with COVID relief funds. And as they were doing that work, they thought it was really important for other folks to understand all the different languages, all the different communities that are being represented in LA County. And so they worked with UCLA to do this digitizing of this map, so that you have access to that. And as part of the work that they were doing as they were giving assistance, they were also trying to figure out, okay, well, these communities of different folks, what were the industries in which they work? And so they also, as you see in the graph, the survey showed that 44% said they worked in the restaurant industry, 29% in the cleaning sector, and 11% in clothing factories. And so when we talk about, right, these are some of the areas that were most hit during COVID. And so just want to acknowledge that as we come back to school and as we have these potential students in our classroom, that taking that into account as well, that their families have been hit hard, not just by the pandemic, but also the economic effects of the pandemic as well. Thank y'all. That was a lot. So let's have a moment to digest all the information that was just thrown your way. And if there's any questions or comments, if you want to learn more about Cielo and about the different communities in LA County, I'm sorry, I think that, yeah, that's a good resource that I just dropped into the chat. Okay, thank y'all so much.
I'm gonna assume people are playing with that wonderful resource a little bit. Anybody have anything that is resonating, standing out, that you're thinking as you look at this?
Also just want to acknowledge, right, that we're here to talk about Mesoamerican history, but that, right, we are the descendants of Mesoamerican cultures. I am a descendant of Mesoamerican cultures, and so we haven't gone away, and we're still here, and so just want to acknowledge that as well.
Okay. I want to make sure that we give people some voice. I know when I looked at this on the map and I played with it, I was kind of shocked that you could go to a zip code and it could tell you specifically what community, right? And one of the things that shocked me was how I was glad to see that communities were supporting one another. And I assume that that's why there were more people in a certain zip code or an area. But then it also made me sad, on the other hand, that it made me think about, are people not being welcomed? Are people not finding services and work in other parts of the LA basin? So it made me think about it two ways, right? And so that was kind of interesting to me. And I began to wonder if we have a similar map for the country to see where indigenous communities who have come here from Mesoamerica, from Latin America, are located across the country. So that was something that this brought up for me in terms of thinking about making connections.
You know, playing around with that map, Amparo, I'm a little surprised to see just how many languages are spoken and how widespread Zapotec is spoken throughout the LA basin. I knew that there were indigenous languages that were spoken, but I hadn't realized how widespread and kind of the diversity that exists there in language.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, Vanessa, because that's one of the things that Cielo and the folks at UCLA that were creating this map, that's one of the things that they said is like this also needs to get into the hands of educators and more school districts, because when we're thinking about, are we servicing the needs of our students, this can be a big factor, that language factor, right? And making sure that everyone's needs are being addressed. So thank you for saying that.
I'm sure that's something that's at their attention too, because with all of the recent arrivals of the kiddos, my sister's a counselor and she'll say the same thing, like, we don't have people to translate these exams. We don't have people to help they don't have the resources. You assume the kiddos come with like Spanish, but they don't. They speak a totally different language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also part of the conversation with reaching out to community organizations like Cielo, who are beginning to develop workshops and institutes for indigenous language speaking translators, right? And so that, I think it's really important. My son has had a lot of medical issues in his life. And so I think of like how I would feel if my child was sick and I could not understand what was being told to me, right? And so like Veronica was saying, I began to think about like, so are there available translators for the doctors, for emergency personnel? I'm not sure that that's happening. So that was also where I began to think about schools and in case of emergencies, are these communities in our area of finding the support and the help that they need?
And Cindy, I think I agree with you. I would love to see the map expanded to see, so we know we have this huge diversity of Indigenous peoples living in the LA basin, and we can see all the different languages, but I'm really curious to know, like, where else are there in the country? Where else do we see big clusters of Indigenous folks living that are coming primarily from Indigenous communities in Latin America?
Yeah. I think that would, I think that would be very interesting if it could be done. I don't know where other communities are at with it. Thank you, everyone. I see there were a couple more things in the chat, and unfortunately, I don't have two screens. So if anyone said something in the chat and you want to comment, go ahead and do so.
Well, and I just, sorry, before we jump into the chat, I just wanted to acknowledge that when we were doing work in Oxnard, there's a big Zapotec community there, but also something that came up for us as we were working with the educators was like I know we're talking about Latino, Latinx Heritage Month, and we're using this as a monolith because we do need a way to categorize folks. But a big issue that was happening in that community was that new migrants and Indigenous migrants were being ostracized and even bullied by third, fourth generation Latinos in the community, or like folks that considered themselves like mestizo Mexicanos. And so that was something that, like, as we're thinking about, you know, we obviously want to like know what populations we need to serve better. But like anti-indigeneity is such a widespread problem across the Americas, and it's showing up in our classrooms and in our school settings as well. And it's something that doesn't get talked about enough, but definitely needs to be talked about and like trying to figure out solutions.
I'll say one last comment before I move on is that when I worked in New York for a long time when Indigenous communities were coming to New York. And it was very interesting to see that connection. Cindy reminded me of anti-indigeneity, but also colorism and how that worked within the communities that I worked at in New York City, right? Not only was it an issue of whether you identified or whether you could identify as being Indigenous, but also that whole issue of colorism and your facial features, right? And so I think that that's important to think about, right? How does this casta system from Mesoamerica get transplanted into the US? And what are the implications as well there? As well as this idea for me that folks who have been here for many generations, we're still not free of that anti-indigeneity, right? Because of what we've learned in the United States, but also from we've learned or have learned, heard from our own parents back home. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So I wanted to transition to us thinking about, given what we've been talking about, when you think about what you learned, what your students learned about Mesoamerica, I wanted us to think about what is a short history. And so a short history, I stole it from someone, I believe it was Professor Laura McEnany. She borrowed it from somewhere else, so it's going around. Is this that it's a summary that catches the beginning, the middle, and end of a story, right? Of a historical story of a people or of a group. And so an example of that, which a lot of us grew up with or learning in school, was Rosa sat, Martin marched, and then they passed the Civil Rights Act and everything was pretty good, right? So given that example, can you type what you think the short story your students usually experience when it comes to the history of Mesoamerica? What is that short story that our students are experiencing when it comes to the history of Mesoamerica? And I'll ask Cindy or Daniel to read the chat. Oh, I see one, I think.
Daniel, if you don't mind, because I'm responding to some comments.
No, that was me. That chat was me. Okay, here we go. Kelly says, and you can also unmute if you would like. I think the dominant narrative students get is that Aztec Empire rise and fall.
Mhm.
Aztec sacrifice people. Olmecs built giant head things. Cortez comes and kills everyone.
Yes, absolutely.
Callie just affirms that, yeah, a lot of my students talk about human sacrifice when they come to my class.
Absolutely. I see one more maybe.
Yeah, Pierre is been sharing some resources from her classroom from Texas. So some lesson plans and resources. So she's been sharing that.
Thank you. We needed some more in our Padlet, so that's great.
Yeah, it's super cool to see stuff from another state too. So thank you for sharing.
So absolutely, right? The stories that usually get focused on is this encounter, right? And the Spaniards, have these big ships, and the indigenous folks are dressed very, scantily. We focus on Teotihuacan. And then what I feel ends up happening with what we are able to or can get to in terms of looking at Mesoamerica is that Mexico gets centered, right? And so Tenochtitlan gets taught, Teotihuacan, and that's pretty much what students get. The other thing that happens is that we center this colonization, right? There's these big fights, and the Spaniards get beat up sometimes, but usually they win and they conquer everyone, and then everyone becomes a Christian. And then lastly, the thing that happens is this idea that, like Daniel said, somebody put in the chat, they all die, right? They all die because of diseases, because of the wars, or because they're all become mestizos and they're now part of this casta, right? And they acquire the dress of and the customs of the Europeans. Once in a while, what we see is there is mention of indigenous people later on in the 10th grade or 11th grade, but it's usually in this way around this legacy of violence, right? It's either looking at massacres, looking at destruction, and uprisings that failed, or we see, oh, wait, look, there's these pockets of indigenous people that survived. Nobody found them for a long time. Look at the Amazon and look at what they've done and how they continue to hold on to the traditions in a way that demonstrates that they're not civilized. And so our students are left with these ideas around indigenous people, and therefore it doesn't surprise me that then students are bullied when they come to the United States. They're bullied within their own communities, and they are shy and nervous about sharing their traditions and indigeneity, because unfortunately what we teach in the United States perpetuates stereotypes, or it makes it seem like everybody died, they're nowhere around. And so we wanted to share, so what do we think is missing, right? And part of this is that not only did indigenous people resist, they persisted, they survived, right? They combined customs and ideas that made them into something new. They continue to advocate for themselves and their community and the planet. And they live in diaspora in the United States. And this is a picture of the women from Cielo that you can see there. On the top, you see a group of women who attended an environmental conference. And then the picture of the gentleman is one about the World Bank. The World Bank's report attesting to the fact that indigenous people's lives and economic stability continues to be threatened throughout Latin America. And the last picture is a mural at the LA County Library. Okay, so how do we begin to think about this, right? What do we do around when we know what we have to teach in the 6th and 7th grade and 8th grade? Anyone? Oh, I see lots of things. Comments? Anyone, please feel free to unmute. So what do we think we can start to do?
Whoops, I was muted. MC, you want me to read the chat?
Yes, please, because I can't see it.
Okay. I'm helping Miss Amparo right now.
Okay.
Okay, so Ron is talking about, one thing is like thinking about other avenues of like resources. So he's talking about if one of his favorite films was a short film called Rebel Music. I think it was on MTV. It was a Native American hip hop episode from North American indigenous people. Not indigenous people of Mexico and Central America, but it's an important thread that allows students to see Native American indigenous youth of today using music to resist colonization, land destruction, abduction of Native women happening in North America. Leo says, I read aloud the encounter described by Dr. Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, brainstormed the stereotypical responses that made Europeans more advanced, and then we seek to disprove those myths with research, help redefine what civilized, in quotes, is, which is something that Amparo, you talk a lot about, right? Unpacking that word. So that's Leo's there with you. And then Jacob is commenting about Jared Diamond, saying that he had to read that as required reading in high school, and he did not enjoy it, I guess.
Yeah, some of the, and I think that that's part of the conversation. I love that. Because one of the things that we have to balance, I think, is these given curriculums that we have, our pacing guides, but also our students' lives, right? Like Jacob was saying, that's hard reading, that like, you know, that can be hard for young people. And also that our young people right now are going through a lot, right? So how do we balance that with updating this historiography that we have that says Indigenous people in Mesoamerica, in the Americas, did not disappear, they're here, right? How do we acknowledge those of our students who have connections to these communities? And then how do we think about, how do we not let Indigenous communities and cultures stay in the past? How do we bring to our students some of those current issues so that they feel connected, so they understand much more of what's going on around them? And so we've been talking a lot about how do we connect our curriculum in the 7th grade in particular to Indigenous peoples in the Americas today? What would it mean to think about how people in many Indigenous communities throughout the Americas are very much see themselves and care about being the stewards of the land and the sea? And how might we use what we already have and maybe supplement it to create that kind of connection for our students? So last time, for those of you who were here, we talked about our process for coaching and working with teachers. I have to say that because Vanessa and I have known each other for a long time, I reached out to her and I said, hey, Vanessa, would you be interested in helping me think about this? And she and I met a couple of times, and we thought about what would it look like, right? To create something that was project-based, something that had inquiry, something that connected a Mesoamerica curriculum from like the 7th grade to what is happening today, and got students excited around being advocates for the environment as well. And so we very much so created a C3 model that I'm going to share with you. And these are the 4 ways that we divided this unit, right? We talked about the cosmology of being stewards of the land across the Americas. Then we started to look at what is happening, what happened with food and the earth in terms of what happened in times before. Europeans arrived and how food was being produced. We talked about that Columbian exchange and not only looking at the positives, right, so that everybody got potatoes and can have pizza, but also thinking about the negative impacts of that with the environment. And up to today, thinking about the continuing issues going on with things such as NAFTA and what that's doing to the environment. And then asking students to do some research and advocacy on behalf of the environment, on behalf of Indigenous communities, and looking for sustainable ways of farming and caring for the earth. And so what we're gonna do now, and this is what it looks like, and you will get a copy of it in a moment. Vanessa's gonna share with you a little bit more of our thinking process and some images, and then we'll give you time to look at it. Sorry, my computer's slow. Life in Whittier after 4 o'clock, it gets real slow. So each part of the inquiry of the unit has inquiry questions that go along with it and formative assessments that students create. And then what you're gonna get a chance to look at is gonna be another C3 with tons of resources. We know there's a lot of them. The ones that we've highlighted will be ones that we're gonna invite you to take a look at more closely. And so with that, let me pass it on to Vanessa.
Thank you, Amparo. So I've taught 7th grade quite a few different times. And like Amparo had mentioned, we have those 4 inquiry questions. And I think inquiry question 1 and inquiry question 2 is kind of where I would get stuck in terms of teaching this standard on the Aztec Maya and the Inca. So the relationship to land and how it is that these 3 different civilizations adapted the land to meet their needs. I think especially if you use TCI in their texts or any of their curriculum, it sort of gears you in that direction. So in the framework that we've created, inquiry question 1 and inquiry question 2, there's a lot less resources because we're assuming that you have those resources, because we're assuming that you all, similar to myself, when teaching these units in the 7th grade, that's kind of where we stayed, because that's where the standard is focused on those 2 different questions. So the texts, the things that we have are already focusing on that. That brings us to inquiry question 3, looking at then the impacts of colonization on farming in ancient Mesoamerica and the land and food production today. We start there with this, with some information about the Columbian exchange and looking at the back and forth of that, and how my love for tacos is directly linked to the Columbia exchange here of all of those things that you would need to be able to have that, kind of the good and the bad that's going back and forth. And then we were thinking, Amparo and I were thinking, well, what if we bring that forward? What does that look like when we look at colonization kind of today? So we looked at NAFTA a little bit. I've always been a little hesitant to look at NAFTA with 7th graders. I've done it some with seniors in economics, but not here. But I think that it is totally doable. We have quite a few different resources there of different ways to look at it, and focusing on 2 different crops, specifically corn and what NAFTA did for corn production in Mexico and how that leads. I'm seeing a lot of this stuff coming through the chat there, how corn production in Mexico, the United States is flooding the market with corn. Mexico is exporting a lot of its corn. So many indigenous farmers in Mexico are then displaced, leading to more migration north. And then avocados, and how there's a direct link between the amount of avocados that folks in the United States consume to NAFTA. It used to be a pretty small part of the diet in the United States, depending again on where you're from. And now the United States consumes a huge amount of avocado. And there also, there's some links there to the popularity of avocado then leading to kind of drug cartels getting into the avocado business as well, and kind of the trade that's going that way. So looking at a couple different resources there. If you can move the slide, please, Amparo. And then we started to look at, okay, what are the impacts of colonialism on the land? And again, in this idea of like, how do we broaden just past where we've started in our teaching. So we've got these two side-by-side images of the exact same place. So one image, sort of Tenochtitlan, there, the city on the lake, the story that we know and that we teach. And then next to it, we are looking at the exact same place. So you can see exactly in one image where that Templo Mayor is, and then where the Templo Mayor is in present day. And seeing those impacts of colonialism right there played out in the land and the politics of land and the politics of present day land and water in Mexico City. Amparo, if you can play the video for just one quick second. We're not going to watch the whole thing. And Amparo, to hear the sound, you'll have to make sure that you're unmuted.
Sorry, guys, it's slow.
It's okay. We'll give it a second, and if it doesn't want to play, that's fine.
I'm glad actually that we got to meet here because this is where the story really all began. Right here, the Templo Mayor was the seat of Tenochtitlan, which was raised by the Spaniards during the conquest. Now Mexico City rests over it. This used to be a sprawling lake, and they had built out growing gardens and built the entire city out from this one point. When the Spaniards came through and leveled the city, they then built their empire on top of it. In doing so, they destroyed all of the levees, all of the aqueducts, and their sort of half-brain solution was to just drain the lake and build the city on top of it. This is a valley, so valleys do flood, but their water resource is now underground. So in Mexico City, they are essentially drinking the water that's underneath them, and as a result, the city is sinking.
You can go ahead and pause it there, Amparo. And we could go back to the slide deck. Thank you. So here we have this like present day, real live land connection between colonization and what is happening in present day Mexico City. Like as a direct result of colonization, we've got literally sinking buildings and a real live problem that is going on in Mexico City. We've got quite a few different resources there that kind of explore this issue of water and land in Mexico City. That brings us to inquiry question 4 of then, again, this is kind of the piece again of trying to bring all these things up to present day. Then how do we use this ancient knowledge? How do we use this indigenous knowledge to heal and sustain our planet? Lisa Lucero has this idea in one of the cosmology and conservation of the Mayan people. One of the resources there is an interview with her. That one is pretty cool because students can both listen to the interview and read it. It's coming out of NPR. And she talks a lot about the Maya and Mayan aqueducts and how water was used and captured and stored in Mayan times. Bringing that forward in that middle picture, we're looking at an image of present day water collection in Mexico City. Water is a big issue there. Once that lake is drained, now there's not enough water for the inhabitants of Mexico City. So one of the solutions or a piece of the solution is to do rain capturing, which is something that the Maya were doing, something that the Inca were doing to help ease some of those problems, bringing it into the United States and bringing it into California. Like right now, in 2 weeks, you can go and you can get yourself a free rain barrel to help ease some of the drought that's happening in the United States too. So we're trying to make those connections between what was happening, how Indigenous folks were looking at some of the environmental issues around them and how they were solving them, and then looking at, well, how can we bring these forward into present day? To use them, or how are they being used today?
Thank you, Vanessa. And so now we're gonna invite you to take a look at the C3. And like we did last time, please also use this time to, you can explore it. We've highlighted some pieces that we thought might be really interesting to focus on. We're gonna give you about 8 to 10 minutes to explore. And then we'll come back together as a group and we'll have some conversation about it. Feel free to get some water, take a bathroom break, get up and stretch, all of that good stuff, and to turn off your camera if you've had it on. And if somebody can put that in the chat, that'll be great. My computer's a little slow. So this part of our conversation is really just that, right? For us to think about what kind of pieces did you explore, what it resonated with you, what questions you have, and also how you might think about using this in your classroom. So I just wanted to open it up for really a conversation amongst us. And so when you are ready, please feel free to just jump in and talk and share your ideas.
Want me to read the chat, Amparo?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so Kelly is, let me turn my camera on first so y'all can see me. Shoot. All right, so Kelly is saying she likes the ending piece, you know, the writing an editorial position paper, so the slide deck, TikTok type, to advise the community on how to use indigenous farming methods to preserve land, help the environment.
Thank you, Kelly. Those of you who didn't get a chance to, there's a piece that talks about a student project, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about those two possibilities. Thank you, Kelly. That's a good reminder. Anyone else?
No, but one of the things that I spent some more time going through and relooking at was all the different things on the Inca. I think because we get stuck on Tenochtitlan and then we get a little bit of Maya in there, and the Inca, as someone was mentioning in the chat, talking about, don't forget about Pizarro.
Yeah.
Often get left to the sideline of like, oh, and then there was an Inca Empire as we're kind of racing through pacing plans. So I really appreciate just a new resources on the Inca Empire and all of, you know, all the unique things that we're going down there and all the different ways that we can use the Quechua people and bring them and talk about them in present tense as well, and look at things that they are doing to care for the land in Peru today and how we use those things in the United States as well.
Yeah, that sustainable bridge, the Queswachaka Bridge is really incredible. If you look at that video, it's really quite remarkable. And it's a sustainable bridge, right? And I know that with all the flooding that's been happening in the US lately, we've been talking about what kind of bridges could we build that would be sustainable. So that's where I thought that was a nice link as well. I see there's some more stuff in the chat. Hopefully I'm right.
Yeah, someone is asking for, some people are on the road, so they're asking for the links to be sent. So I'll take care of that on both.
Yeah, you will get all the links. Remember, Mark has done this incredible job of sending everyone a copy of the links to the resources, but also of whatever a session we have that we record. You will also get access to that if you're on the road and unable to.
I was just gonna say that one, like an extension piece to Vanessa's comment is like, one thing that doesn't get talked about enough, and maybe that might be the bridge, pun intended, for like bringing in the Incas, is that like how expansive the trade was. Like even this idea that like, I mean, as far south, but also like that North American natives are also trading in Tenochtitlan, in Mesoamerica, that, you know, that's why we have turquoise. Like that's not native to the Mesoamerican region. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Like when we talk about like the Silk Road in 7th grade, we talk about how expansive the Silk Road is, but like the trading routes across the Americas were just as expansive and important.
Cindy, I feel like that's a nice way too to make sure that we at least mention that, hey, here are these 3 civilizations that we're talking about, but there were lots of them and they still exist as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just the Inca alone had 25,000 miles worth of roads for trading, right? And so, I mean, that to me is remarkable. So,
and a lot of those roads are still in use today.
mm-hmm. Anyone else? Any other? What about, is this a unit that is feasible, parts of it to use in your classroom as you think about your pacing currently?
I guess I can share something that's making me think about is students and myself researching like different roles that Indigenous and Latinx folks have had towards the land. And then I'm also thinking, I live near the Bayona wetlands. Mm-hmm. And like thinking about, well, how is history being preserved? Mm-hmm. How is the present being preserved? How is it being talked about? And how can we talk about it in better ways? Like students taking what they're learning and then pushing forward to say, hey, this is how we should be talking about the Bayona wetlands. So those are just thoughts I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. I've been doing a lot of work with 3rd and 4th grade teachers. If you look at the resource on the second part of the unit, it talks about the Tamba. That's from the Audubon Society. And it really takes a look at just how much the Tangva, they were really extensive, the land that they cared for, and their farming methods and their seed distribution methods and the burning that they did was done in a way that supported the growth in the community of plants and animals, and also provided them with the resources that they needed without damaging the land. So I appreciate that very much, because that's also a very important part of what we're doing here, as well as some of those videos that I shared with you guys about tending the wild and thinking about how our Indigenous communities in California right now trying to get people to return to some of those methods in order to help with not only with global warming, but with forest fires and with the drought. So those are also some nice resources for you guys to look at as well. So yes, that's a good reminder.
I'm going to have to take off, but I really, really appreciate the resources that are gathered together. And I can hardly wait to implement them into, actually in Texas, it's our 6th grade curriculum, our world cultures curriculum. And that will be some really wonderful connections, because as we've been thinking through our transfer goals and how we can make those, like, what does it mean to be a global citizen? And this is a great connection to their heritage, to their communities. So I really, really appreciate them. Thank you for gathering and for sharing.
And we hope to hear from you and find out how you make it all work. Please keep in touch.
I'll keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All right. So, anyone else? So part of what Vanessa and I wanted to share with you guys, and I'm gonna have to, two pieces. One of the really important pieces that we wanted everyone to think about is an additional layer, which is that part of our California frameworks for science and social studies really talks about making a connection between what we are teaching and environmental principles, right? And in California, these are our 5 environmental principles. They take a look at how people depend on natural systems, how people influence natural systems, how natural systems change the ways that people benefit from and can influence those natural systems, and then that there are permanent boundaries, that there are boundaries that are not permeable. So when you think about water, right, in terms of the environment, those are boundaries that are impermeable, sorry. And then how do we make decisions about the environment and all the many different factors that go into that in different communities? And I think for me that these are important principles to think about. Like Kelly was saying, I want to see where these principles also coincide with this idea of being caretakers of the land, not only being folks who are benefiting from the land or trying to prevent damage, but also thinking about being stewards of the land. And what does that look like and what does that mean? And so to me, this is this great opportunity to have those conversations and make connections with your science partners at your schools, if they're open to that, and explore that some more, right? How can you get your science teachers to help you explain and think about biodiversity and impact on the land and what is happening with, for example, global warming or drought? And so that's another invitation. One of our other invitations was, and I think I have it wrong, if you look at the last piece of your C3, and Danny, can you do me a favor because I lost all my pieces? Oh no, I can do it from here.
Sure, what do you need?
I know I got it. Here it goes. I'll just open it up there. Can you guys see it? No. Let me try it one more time. What we wanted to show you, and Vanessa, if you want, help me out and talk about where we kind of left off with the project. Oh, good, you guys can see it now.
Yeah.
Did we lose Vanessa? Or
I'm right here.
Are you on mute? Here we go. So Kelly, I think you also like this, right? This is a project from the National Museum of the American Indian, and it asks students to think about exploring the lives of 4 tribal nations in our country. And we thought that this might be a good way if you wanted to extend it to the US, or if you wanted to think about doing this project and having your students look at indigenous communities in Mexico, Central America, and South America. And so it asks students to learn about this nation, right? And share about why this nation or this group of this community is so concerned about the environment. It asks them to explore what that local water, climate, plants are, and how the environment supports the tribal's cultural traditions and economy. And then to look at that impact, that negative impact that is happening to the area or to the environment, and then how this community is working to repair the damage. And then lastly, it asks students to think about what is an environmental issue in their own community, and how they might begin to help address that issue in their own community. So this is a template that you can find here on from the museum. And if you're an 8th grade teacher, certainly you could connect to these 4 communities, or if you wanted to, in the 7th grade, look at one of the Mesoamerican indigenous communities, you could also do that. And so we wanted to share with you that at the end, we thought, does that project need to be really complicated? How can we connect students with what's going on around them? How could students do some research, maybe around communities in the US and what they're going through? But also certainly, if you look at in your C3, there's connections to current activists and current people in Central America, South America, who are having to leave their homes because of the drought. So that one is there, and there's another project. So I don't know, Vanessa, if there was something else you wanted to add.
No, I think that pretty much sums it up, Amparo, of just like, how do we use that, the model that they set up there with that template, I think can be adapted for Latin America really easily, or just looking at pieces of it. But I love the way it really dives deep into looking at Indigenous folks, and then looking at how we can bring that stuff forward to present day, and how they are doing those things in present day as well.
I assume people are going to take a couple of minutes to look at those as well. Let me bring us back. My computer and I are not getting along today. Apologize for that. Does it feel like having students do that kind of a project would be feasible and work easily for you as teachers? Oh, there go the student projects. I knew I had them in there. The other project is from MAD, which is Making a Difference project, not MAD as in Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's Making a Difference. That's the other community project. And they have a very similar, they have a simple template as well in terms of what's the problem, what might be the action that I want to take, and what research do I need to do for it. And then this one I didn't put in here. But the last community project that we wanted you to think about was the junior walkers. Can someone put that in there? I'm serious, my computer's not happy right now.
Amparo, something that I wonder with this is, like, I noticed that a lot of YPAR stuff and research stuff focuses on like problems, like what's the problem in your community? And I'm wondering how we can even shift that, where it can be like, you know, what are similar things that you see within your community, that where you see these Indigenous practices being done? I don't know, I'm like wondering, like, I'm just wondering like how we can shift like the idea of focusing, and I think addressing like issues is really important, but then sometimes we get so focused on like the issue that it becomes deficit of like, my community doesn't have these things, when in fact like our communities have so many amazing things, and like we ourselves are not, there's so much abundance in our own selves. And I'm thinking about, for myself, it's so easy for me to say, I don't have these things, or my community doesn't have these things, instead of coming from a, like an abundance mindset of like, no, I do have these things. My students have these things. My community has these things.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly, because that was one of the things that we also try to bring to it, which was like, hey, check this out. Vanessa, tell us about those pictures of the terraces. You're muted.
You would think that by now I'd know how to unmute myself. But one of the things that I kind of got obsessed about was terrace farming. And we see examples of that in the Maya. We see examples of that in the Inca. And we see examples of that all over East LA and San Pedro and a bunch of different really hillside communities all over Los Angeles. The people that have community gardens that are terraced, that have backyard gardens that are terraced, that have working like sell produce farms that are terraced. And I think that kind of gets to what you're saying, Kelly, of like, we're doing these things. Communities in LA are doing these things. And in their, in the C3, there is a link to a bunch of different images of different farms. A bunch of different images of different farms and community gardens that are terraced throughout the city, and then excerpts from an article from the LA Times that was interviewing one of the farmers, and that person directly saying, "Hey, I didn't come up with this idea. This is a very old idea that I'm now putting into use."
And those water gallons, right? I mean, Vanessa and I shared that growing up, when my family went back to Mexico, at the teenagers, that was our job, was to stay up really late. And when the water was opened up and released, we were supposed to fill up all the huge 50 water gallon tanks that my grandmother had, where we took water to sweep and mop and wash bathrooms, but also wash clothes, right? And dishes. And so that was our job, was to stay up and gather this rainwater or gather water when it was released from the dam to preserve and to cover it and hold. And it was saved because obviously when there were tons of us there in the family, they needed more water. So they were like, whatever, the teenagers are going to stay up messing around. That's your job, right? And so this idea of capturing the rainwater, and I remember moving some of the tambos, right? So that they would capture the water and then wait for the rest of the water to come in, that those are really old ideas, and that as a community, a lot of our older folks know about those things, and how do we come back to those and look at those? I really appreciate that, right? As well as who do I ask in my community who's doing some of these things? How do I find some of these folks who might have some of that knowledge, and connecting younger folks with older folks in terms of intergenerational ways of looking at solving some of these problems, I think is important.
I think too that I mean, my family, both my grandparents and my parents have tambos here in LA. They've got water collection systems that they use, that they're really excited about, that they use to water plants. And I think there is more of an emphasis in the Latinx diaspora to really focus on conservation cultura, the things that we inherently are doing that are already in the conservation vein, that are the reusing of things, the tons of different plants and matitas that my grandmother has all over her yard. All of these things are part of solutions as well, and I agree, are things that we are already doing and folks in our communities are already doing.
I'm muted. Of course. We wanted to end today's conversation. Oh, here. This is a site for a group called the Junior Water Walkers. And the Junior Water Walkers, this is where I got the project for the MAT project, is really thinking about how can young people be part of the preservation and the caring for water. So this might also be a connection and an organization that your students might be able to connect with. So I wanted to make sure that you guys got a chance to look at them, and it connects to the book that Cindy shared. Their book is also there for you to take a look at. We wanted to end today with a little bit of a conversation around thinking about some healing and thinking about how do we think about what has been going on in our communities? And how do we think about the upcoming celebration of Dia de los Muertos, right? And I really wanted to bring up for folks in your agenda, you have some resources that really pinpoint how Dia de los Muertos, if you want to see Amparo cranky, one of the ways is to say that Dia de los Muertos is Mexican Halloween, because it's really, really bothersome to me that it's not Halloween. It's not about ghosts and goblins. It's a way of connecting to ancestors. And it's very much rooted in this idea of resistance, right? Resisting the taking away of traditions and finding new ways of expressing it by holding this day as a day to connect with ancestors and bring offerings to tombs. And so a couple of the articles that I put in your agenda address that, as well as this idea that Cindy and others have shared about that it all ends up being about Mexico. And so one of the other articles that I put in there for you was a Oaxacan community, I believe it is in Mexico, that does kites, and the children are try to build their own kites, and it's part of their curriculum, and it's a holiday in their community. And then that there are these wonderful, beautiful kites in Guatemala that are also flown that day. And two of the articles there, one of them talks about how that's changing and the themes are changing, but the other one talks about the historiography of the barriletes in Guatemala. And I wanted to end with a conversation around how, given everything that our community has gone through, how we might think about helping young people see this connection to the past, but also have a time to express in some way of, whether it be through an altar, if that's something that your school allows, but to have some of the kind of artistic expression to connect with some of the losses that they've had. So I wanted to open that up for conversation and for people to ask questions if you don't already do it, or if you weren't considering it because of COVID, what else it might look like. I just wanted to throw it out. Something get put in the chat?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I think, well, I know Kelly is processing the slide, so folks might be doing the same.
And I was gonna say too, just as seeing her comment, is that like I think the connections to Mesoamerican cosmology, like it's up on the slide, that sometimes is missed. Like there's a lot of focus on the calacas, there's a lot of focus on the crosses, but this idea of having the 4 elements represented in Malpad, the idea of having the 3, that the altar should have 3 levels to represent the underworld, the earth plane, and the skies, the heavens, or the skies, I should say. Like those are the kinds of things that I feel like don't get highlighted at times when we're talking about the Dia de los Muertos. Like, so that's something to think about, is that like bringing up how like when in the concept of mestizaje, right? Like it's a mixture, so it's not just one side or the other, and like making sure that those the elements of cosmology, of ancestral cosmology, get brought up as well. But I also think that, especially in Los Angeles, like going past that and talking also, not going past it, but also bringing up like Dia de los Difuntos and how that's in different parts of Central America, like that is what is practiced, right? So we don't even have calacas, that's not a thing for us, but we definitely have the cleaning of the graves and talking about memories of family members as we're cleaning the graves. And like, so we have parts of that, but it's not, that's definitely not brought up enough either. It's like, how do different folks across Mesoamerica
and even in Mexico itself, like we have so many different indigenous communities that, you know, I lived in Veracruz for a while, and there are no calacas there. There's no cempasúchil there. It's corn stalks in a very different way, and building these kind of, they almost look like cubes out of corn stalks that then housed photos and things like that. You know, and also as we're exploring this whole unit, looking at, you know, colonization and how that impacted everything in land and whatnot. I mean, this is another side of that, because if we look at the Catholic Church, I mean, there's All Saints Day and All Souls Day. Like, these are actual holidays that existed that were then kind of combined with the indigenous things that were already happening.
Mhm.
But I do think it is important, and something that I hadn't really thought a whole lot about, to provide a little bit of a space for reflection in terms of loss, because all of us have fought, all of us, and especially our students and some of the communities that we work with, have felt a lot of loss. And just to have a place and in a historical context in which to experience that loss kind of helps.
I also think that for many families, I know that when I've done this with younger children, and parents get to come to the school, and I know this year they may not be able to, the conversation about thank you, maestra, thank you, maestro, you allowed my son to have a connection to grandparents, right? We can't go back to El Salvador or Mexico or Guatemala to be there that day with our family members at the cemetery. But this is a way that we feel connected. And so that's also an important piece, right? That it's this connection to ancestors and to family, and remembering them, and having conversations between young people, or the little ones especially, and others about, so who is this person, mom? You gave me this picture of this man who's my grandfather. Tell me about him, so that I have some context for bringing this image, right, to school. And so to me, that's also an important part of that. It's that connection to diaspora, and that connection, right, to family and to people. And I forgot to include this, but Cindy came up with this amazing virtual altar piece. We will make sure that we include it in your resources, where we talked about, you know, if it's not possible for people to come together, how could teachers create virtual altars and have students take a picture of the picture or image and put it in the altar, and then have something like that as well to converse.
I'm gonna drop in the chat right now a write-up from the state office about Pláticas. And at the bottom, it has the worksheet, but I do think that this is another opportunity to engage in Pláticas or with family photographs. Is like looking at a relative or an ancestor, somebody who's now an ancestor, and being like, let's have a conversation about them. Una plática, right? So much more than a conversation. That can be part of this during this time.
I was just going to ask you to do that too, Cindy. She read my mind. All right. It's almost 6, and I can't even believe how you guys have stuck things out with us. Cindy, can you tell us who is coming on Monday and what we're going to be looking at on Monday? And I think none of us would be upset if we ended a little early.
Sounds good. I'm just wanting to, let's see. Yeah, okay, because there was a question Kelly asked about the resources.
Go ahead, Kelly, or I didn't see the chat.
Oh, no,
Good, thank you.
I'm resharing the agenda because
Yay, thank
that's,
you.
yeah, that's what the resources for Dia de los Muertos is. And yeah, just as a preview for next week, we'll be talking about Teaching Central America Week, which is coming up in October, which is tomorrow. So we'll be in the week of Teaching Central American Week. Very important note, because we want to make sure to have left enough time for y'all to think through what that might look like in your classroom. We're actually doing our presentation on Monday. So it won't be next Thursday, it's on Monday. Same bat channel, same bat hour. And we will be talking, thinking through being culturally responsive in our teachings of Central America. And we will have a special guest who is part of DESWA, which is Indigenous Mayan grassroots organization that helps folks moving back to Guatemala from the United States. But I think he'll give us some really good insight as to he was born in the US, went to US public schools, and made the choice to move back to Guatemala. And so we'll be having a conversation with him and Dr. Boj Lopez from UCLA's Chicana and Chicano Studies Department and Central American Studies Department. So we look forward to engaging in conversation with you all on Monday.
I'm excited.
We want to say thank you so much for being with us today. I especially want to thank Vanessa. She's worked really hard at finding resources and developing ideas, and Cindy for helping us at the beginning. And of course, Daniel and Mark. Thank you, everyone. We are so appreciative of your time and all that you've been bringing. And we look forward to seeing you on Monday.